Lockdown effectiveness. Did lockdown work? We'll find out in a minute. Note to censors, we use only government data. If you have a problem with the results, speak to the government. For lockdown to work, it has to change the trajectory of the virus. You can study the path of the cases or deaths, or the rate of the growth of the cases or deaths, but it is inadequate to say that lockdown worked, the rate of growth is declining. The rate of growth of cases or deaths is always declining in a normal contagion. We're going to be accusing the government of fraud. Maybe not all of them, but the UK, US, New York especially, and Belgium, EU HQ, and the EU core nations, France, Spain, etc. Absolutely. If you have a problem with that, do you have a problem with getting angry at speeding drivers, child molesters, tax evaders, or politicians of the other party? Why then, simply because we're discussing a disease, and diseases have been around a long time, should you place people who go to great lengths and spend a lot of money acquiring power beyond scrutiny? No one gives those politicians money without expecting something in return. Support for an ideology or support for a commercial agenda. And there is an agenda here. So when we look at COVID-19 from a scientific perspective, from the purest of scientific perspectives, maths, and the simplest, straight lines, then if we get indignant at what that reveals, I'd say we have every right to be so, in the light of actions taken by the governments of the world against their own people. Lockdown is already the most destructive civil action ever undertaken by governments against the freedom, ability to work, and democracies that we are supposed to be a part of. And recently, Leicester, UK, was placed under lockdown for 900 people not being sick. They were tested positive for COVID, but needing to be tested, were they sick or asymptomatic? Melbourne, Australia, apparently has just been placed under lockdown. Australia is the haven of COVID success, along with all its other Far Eastern brethren. They've brushed off the disease where the Western power centres somehow contrive to be a hit 122 times, 133 times, and 350 times UK, Belgium and New York City by the same virus. It is a totalitarian autocracy running riot. So if you don't like science, fine. If you don't like maths, fine. But if you just don't like the results, that's an emotional issue you're going to have to deal with. Our analysis is straightforward and sound. The results are unequivocal. The results claimed by governments around the world are utterly fraudulent. Lockdown fails every time. But if we find one that worked, we'll be sure to let you know. If you've seen a target video, currently only one, New Zealand, then you can skip to slide 57 or so, the Wikipedia list of lockdown countries. If you haven't yet shared the fraudulent exponential meme, I suggest you look at all the images you can online of contagions past and present, with their charts for daily or weekly cases or deaths. You will find humped curves galore. That isn't exponential, that's normal or quasi-normal, logistic, podhertz, whatever, and humped curves have a declining rate of growth from day one. Here's a selection chosen from the web. Humped, normal, or approximately so. So that means that you have to respect the characteristics of a normal or humped curve. Of one of those is that the rate of growth is declining from day one. It has to. You cannot shape the curve without it. The normal distribution has an additional convenient feature. That rate of growth decline is a constant factor, meaning that growth rates declining by a constant factor will present a straight descending line on log scales. Even Ferguson's ICCRT Report 9 chart with the scary totals, notice on the graphic, used a normal log-normal distribution for unmitigated no lockdown, and still people believed the exponential meme. That is truly scary. So this is a normal distribution. The shape should look familiar, even that of the cumulative totals on the right. It is a classic S or sigmoid curve which any peak distribution must generate. This is not flattening the curve, i.e. the result of government action, the most destructive and autocratic civil action in the history of our nations, but the normal behaviour of a normal distribution which happens to model COVID-19 pretty damned well. Nor does it matter if you quibble over contagions aren't normal. They're humped, at least pray God. Let us conceive that you can agree with that. So if you have a problem with normal, here's Egyptian. A truly absurd but still peaked curve, and it still has the critical feature that no one has mentioned to you, yet it is the one critical feature of the entire COVID-19 experience. That it totally debunks exponential, that it debunks that lockdown is working, that it debunks the anti-democratic totalitarian measures that have been taken against you, that couldn't have any bearing on why this was never mentioned. I'm going to put this one full screen and likewise the others in due course, and then zoom in even further to highlight the critical point. See if you notice it before I mention it. Here's the hint. What does that F factor represent, and what is happening to it as time progresses, going down the table? That's the growth rate of the virus, or Egyptian plague, take your pick, each day, and what is happening to it? It is declining from day one. So did you ever hear lockdown is working, the growth rate is declining, we're flattening the curve? If so, you were lied to. Can you deal with that? They claimed that government intervention caused an entirely natural phenomenon. Do you thank God that the government made the sun rise, the rain fall? I sincerely hope and pray not. Then why, other than for your prior ignorance, which we're now, I hope, erasing, did you give them credit for flattening the curve when it was happening anyway? And that was our Egyptian peaked curve. Let's try it with a proper normal distribution, which I hope we can agree does look rather more fitting by comparison. And what do we see? The same phenomenon. The growth factor is declining from day one. It has to, else it's exponential. This is such a trivial point mathematically, yet such a critical point for debunking the COVID propaganda. If the growth rate doesn't decline, it is exponential by definition. Times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2, or times 1.2 times 1.2 times 1.2 times 1.2. It doesn't matter. Both are exponential. And this is what exponential looks like, with the same starting rate of growth, f equals 2, but unchanging. By the end of May, I can't be certain, but I think that's more people, maybe even more atoms, than are in the universe who are infected. But we don't want to be unfair to Ferguson. He only seeded his model with doubling every 5 days, 1.15 per day approx. So here's what that looks like. Notice the curling up that looks similar to the normal at the beginning, but is utterly different in outcome. And notice how the cumulative chart has totally lost its curling over, which is natural to normal and never happens with exponential. So they showed you this, which no contagion in history has ever looked like, and then reported total cases or deaths like this, which every contagion in history looks like anyway, and claimed that as evidence of flattening the curve, i.e. the result of their action rather than curling over, our term, the natural and inevitable progression of a contagion. They lied to you with exponential, then took credit for what was going to occur anyway, and you or most of your countrymen, most people around the world, believed them, as they imposed the most destructive and intrusive civil authoritarian measures in history. And if you wonder how they got around exponential rising to more atoms than are in the universe and beyond, they used these, the SI-SIR-SEIR family of models. As the E.X-line shows, their models had the fraudulent exponential built into their models, so it rose exponentially to peak, straight line on log scales as here, curled over sharply, then crashed exponentially to zero. These are the primary epidemiological models in today's science, and they don't model any real-world virus in the slightest. They simply return the massive proportion of whatever population you enter as infected. Great for scaring you, utter nonsense or non-science for proper analysis. Epidemiology, which under far normal distributions began with honour, has sunk into dishonour and fraud, and you are the victims. And if you wonder how accurate they are, here's No Lockdown Sweden that they're supposed to model, using Ferguson's seed growth rate, and Sweden's real data is roadkill, squashed at the bottom of the chart. And Sweden is the 5th worst hit nation in the world, still not number 1 despite no lockdown, and the subject of massive fraud along with the UK, USA and core EU nations. But that's the topic of other videos. So now let's show you some proper analysis rather than the fraudulent memes and claims that have been prevalent in the mainstream media and on social media. This chart shows the daily cases and deaths with auto-fit normals top left and right and the straight lines representing the growth decline rates from the auto-fit. The dashed green is a manually assigned gradient, which is not particularly material here. At the bottom left is the cumulative total from the auto-fit, as well as the growth decline gradients and, if present, the significant actual growth decline that was available to Ferguson prior to the March 23rd lockdown. Remember that critical observation that for a peaked curve, growth rates are declining from day one. There's a remarkable and extremely convenient feature of the normal distribution as opposed to the logistic, log normal or Gompertz or whatever other quasi-normal path you'd care to choose. They are so closely related you could pick any and do a far better job than the criminally fraudulent claims of the government and Ferguson. But normal fits extremely well, see our World Tour videos, and has this rather unique and convenient feature. Yes, the growth rate is declining from day one. It was never exponential. It's a feature of any peaked curve. But look at the change in growth rate. F is the day-to-day growth in cases, here for our example. G is the growth decline factor, today's growth rate or factor, divided by yesterday's growth rate or factor. That ratio is constant for normal distributions, and that makes it a very convenient feature indeed. Recall that for exponential, the growth rate is constant and shows as a straight line on log scales. Exactly the same is true here. The constant change in growth rate will show as a descending straight line on log scales. Just for emphasis on our Egyptian curve, although f is declining, the rate at which it is declining, g, is not constant. So we're going to go through each country that was listed on Wikipedia as implementing a lockdown and see what effect it had on their chart. If the trajectory of the growth decline didn't change after lockdown, the effect was nil. Now this is a pretty critical analysis, so I don't want there to be any confusion or ambiguity about my logic as to what I'm looking for. So let's take a very simple non-COVID example. If we have a paper dart heading for the ground on a straight trajectory and someone sprinkles fairy dust on the dart and claims that has changed the trajectory of the dart, when the dart continues along its original trajectory, should you believe them? Now, if we have a paper dart heading for the ground on a straight trajectory and someone drops a rock on the dart and claims that has changed the trajectory of the dart, and the dart plummets to the ground, now do you believe them? So sure, if you claim the trajectory has changed because of something you did, and I can see a dramatic or significant change in trajectory, then I'll believe you. So here's what we're looking for. The contagion has its natural trajectory. For lockdown to have an effect, it has to modify that trajectory and increase the rate of decline so there's even lower growth or faster decay than there would have been anyway. So from the start of lockdown, and we've got lockdown effective and the purple growth decline line. What we're looking for is evidence of lockdown effectiveness. If lockdown modifies the growth rate of the virus, it means that the growth will diverge from the standard growth decline it was on and decline faster, so reducing cases relative to the standard growth decline line it was on. And we're showing growth decline accelerating, cases growth reducing faster in the early case before it becomes effective after the incubation period and after that point. So, this is the Albanian chart to 4th of July. I'll put it full screen, then we'll zoom in for greater clarity. Lockdown began 13th of March and post-incubation would be effective a week later. The outbreak it was designed to control was already virtually at peak. Growth decline certainly didn't plummet. In fact, it didn't even break below the green unity line. Instead, they headed into subsequent outbreaks, all showing perfectly normal growth decline lines. And significantly larger contagions. Deaths shows 2 significant outbreaks, both with pronounced growth decline and thus perfectly normal. We really want to see if the growth decline is modified by lockdown in a single overarching contagion. Albania is more of a case of they locked down really, because there's certainly no evidence it did them any good. I won't mark it as a fail though, just no result. It's our first country and not the kind of definitive result we get in e.g. the UK, so I won't mark it as a fail. I see nothing but normal contagions burning out, repeated outbreaks, but as the first chart, it gets a pass. No result. Argentina, Algeria had a city lockdown which we can't readily analyse without convenient data. Argentina went into lockdown on the 19th of March and we'd have to ask why. There's nothing there. And going out to July, they'd have a massive outbreak in cases and deaths by comparison to the March data. In their early contagion, pre and post initiating lockdown, it was a perfectly normal growth decline, 0.985. And they ended lockdown apparently on the 28th of June, with cases and deaths still rising dramatically. Frankly, it's just a big case of it rather defies analysis. But what the heck? That green dotted line is the standard 0.985 decline worldwide. The channel is perfectly consistent with that, with minuscule cases not exactly helping before the start, but established prior to the effective date. I'd hardly cite this one as primary evidence in a court case. It's minuscule cases begging the question as to why on earth they were so keen to lock down, and the outbreak proceeded entirely normally, to be followed by a much more serious primary contagion. Overall, I'd have to ask then what lockdown achieved, but it's hardly definitive by comparison to e.g. the UK. Again, it's showing that standard growth decline, 0.985 we see worldwide, so to me it's totally normal, but we'll let it ride for now. No result. Armenia locked down the 24th of March to 4th of May. This is starting to look familiar. Have a lockdown on minimal cases of deaths, then have a massive outbreak by comparison. Attempting to analyse that first outbreak around lockdown, and the channel continued with the outbreak completing normally. So no apparent effect, and then a massive outbreak following. Doesn't say much for lockdown, does it? Lockdown fail. Australia went into lockdown 23rd March and never came out, never will come out, who knows. Finally, a chunky contagion and lockdown in the middle of it. And the contagion continues, completely unfazed, same growth decline line, and when lockdown becomes effective, the trajectory changes the wrong way. Shallower means less reduction in cases, it's below 1, so more cases relatively. It's plummeting so fast I won't consider that fraud versus the UK, where it goes horizontal at peak, but evidence of lockdown effectiveness, au contraire, lockdown fail. A reminder, here's what we're looking for: a divergence from the established growth decline line. I've yet to see that on any chart, but we're showing willing and going through the official list of lockdown countries to see if it's there, or to unequivocally declare that it's not where possible. As we've seen, a country where the contagion or outbreak is over before lockdown becomes effective is difficult to analyse for a before and after, but where it's possible, this is what we're looking for. Austria, 16th March to 13th April. I actually had to concede we might have a candidate. And Austria, like Germany, has very tidy charts, so it would have been a legitimate win. It's got a well-defined decline that does steepen as lockdown becomes effective, so that looks like a plus for lockdown. But a few days earlier it showed exactly the same gradient of growth decline. What happened in the interim? There's a data spike, a zero value, which you can see in the dotted blue, which messes up the average growth decline either side of it. So growth decline goes shallow, then resumes the steep descent. Consider the supporting evidence. If cases dropped faster than the auto-fit would have predicted, the dotted blue line would fall inside, not outside, slower. I was going to give it a no result, but with that latter observation, I'm happy to state that the contagion completed normally. Bravo Austria for a sharp end to their COVID experience, but the growth decline is consistent before and after lockdown. So lockdown fail. Azerbaijan, or however one says that, 31st March to 20th of April. Same channel prior to lockdown, lockdown becoming effective and post-effective. No effect, lockdown fail. Bangladesh, 26th of March. Bangladesh, another why? Nothing there. Whatever trivial outbreak they had, it was already over, at which point the next few cases arrive, triggering the signature start climb, and the descent starts all over again. It's so tiny we can't even see the cases. I think they're sitting under the solid blue of the perfectly normal theoretical. And then they come out of lockdown 3rd of May, and there's no rise in growth rate. It's just one long haul. I'm tempted to call it a no result, as they managed to implement at the beginning of the trivial outbreak, but we've got two steep and normal outbreak declines, one before lockdown, one after. We've got no rise despite the end of lockdown. We've also got a relatively massive outbreak starting and climbing despite lockdown. All in all, the matching pair, the no rise and the massive outbreak, all say lockdown was a waste of time. Lockdown fail. Barbados, 28th March to 3rd of May. And the growth decline line channel is well established both before lockdown, through incubation and post-lockdown, and unchanged. No effect, lockdown fail. Belgium, 18th March to 4th of May. This is going to be interesting. The world's #1 worst hit nation, 133 times the Far East. And we've also got New York City, 350 times the Far East. That'll be fun too. Well, looky here. The growth decline follows the blue dashed auto-fit pretty damn perfectly all the way through. No effect, lockdown fail, thank you. Bermuda, 4th of April to 2nd of May. I can't help noticing that's a tight lockdown around the actual contagion. Bit of a difference from our perpetual lockdown in the UK and continuing drama, but still, here goes. Again, a first outbreak, with lockdown implemented right at the end of the decline, so hardly helpful. But look at the gradients, matching pre- and post-lockdown and lockdown effective, and totally in line with our world standard 0.985 growth decline. Lockdown fail. Bolivia, 22nd March to 31st July. Well, it's amusing that they ended lockdown at peak, so if cases go down rather than up, it won't say much for without a lockdown cases explode. Frankly, there was nothing there when they went into lockdown, another what, the, and why. Instructions maybe? Me too? Who knows? It had come out of one micro outbreak, the first dip, and was just experiencing the cases that would set it up for the next outbreak, the rise. The rise is perfectly normal. Unlike a normal distribution, which can have 0.00001 cases, the real world deals in integer people, 1, 2, 7, 13. So the first few days we typically see a rise to the starting growth rate and then decline proceeds normally. Ultimately, it doesn't say much for lockdown when yet another country has a massive relatively contagion that follows, and the resulting contagion is very shallow in growth decline, which is worse than normal. But you know what, we don't really have a before to compare our after to, other than that very early mauve and start of purple, between them easily matching the post-lockdown gradient. Going to just let this go as a no result. Botswana, 2nd of April, 30th of April, oh dear, another minuscule cases and straight into lockdown. Rather eager, weren't they, around the world. Lots of mini outbreaks and the world standard 0.985 a perfectly reasonable fit. Final outbreak at a more aggressive decline of 0.976. No prior to lockdown growth available. Just how fast did they get that decision in and why? There's nothing there that's abnormal, but it's so sparse that with no prior to lockdown growth to compare, we'll have to mark it a no result. Colombia, 25th March to 30th of June. Anyone wonder why 23rd March plus or minus might be so popular? A mini research project to see how many reference Ferguson in their decision. Could be a good idea. It's already had a normal decline on minuscule cases, now it settles into a long, slow decline, characteristic of these late contagions. A study for another day. Remember, shallow is less decline, so worse than normal. And it just gets settled into that shallow channel before lockdown and stays in that long shallow decline all the way to just before peak. So no visible effect from lockdown, massive contagion relatively after lockdown, lockdown fail. We have 90 countries to analyse and we've so far done 13. This is going to take a while, so we'll do a few more, then close out this video and continue in further videos. Costa Rica, 23rd March lockdown, that date again. A well-developed channel heading down for the minor outbreak, and far from dropping more steeply, it flattens off, giving relatively higher cases, and then it has that relatively massive outbreak in lockdown, as with so many others. Lockdown fail. Croatia, 18th March to 19th of April. How nice, a perfectly well-defined growth decline line, very tight from before lockdown, through lockdown and post-lockdown effective, and doesn't change a damn thing. Lockdown fail and textbook. Czech Republic, which I trust is Czechia in WHO terms. How nice, another Eastern European nation with a well-defined channel all the way through from prior to post, same gradient and a perfectly normal contagion as a result. Lockdown fail. As a reminder, it's easy to forget when we're not seeing it, but if lockdown doesn't change the growth decline line, then it hasn't had an effect, has it? The contagion proceeded entirely normally. Ecuador, 16th March, 31st March, a bit messy for its data as I recall, but we'll do our best. Another lockdown on nothing with a relatively massive outbreak afterwards. Really doesn't say much for lockdown, does it? Barely started, they locked down so early, it's the vogue apparently. Then as lockdown is supposed to start being effective post-incubation, the growth decline goes the wrong way. It's supposed to increase the decline, so reducing cases further. There's a mini outbreak bigger than original around 11th of April, look at the sharp decline and then find the inevitable hump in cases below. Then a massive spike outbreak, again with an overall pronounced decline. You can't have a hump without a decline in your growth, it's just one of those things in life. Another 16th to 23rd of May, all totally normal, marginal before orange but wrong way at effective, big outbreak, normal outbreaks, lockdown fail. El Salvador, 12th March to 2nd of April. Wow, early, even more precipitous than the indecent haste with which Ferguson-Johnson got us locked down. Would have been embarrassing to get no lockdown in before peak at April 11th in our case. Of course I'm defining peak by the date we hit unity on our growth decline chart. I don't even recall whether we were allowed to peak then, but that's about when our growth decline went sideways and the serious fraud began. Still, El Salvador. You're kidding, right? No growth decline line. Did they even have any cases yet? Normal gradient when it did get started, world standard 0.985. The dotted green line, massive outbreak relative to nothing. Well, it would be, wouldn't it? This deserves a fail for taking the mickey, aka taking the mickey for non-Brits, though it's closer to taking liberties as well. Locking down on nothing? That is just absurd. Normal decline post, massive outbreak, lockdown fail, eat it. Eritrea, 2nd of April to 23rd of April. I like Africa, the land that COVID forgot, and the Tanzanian president is a prince, maybe not literally, but sending mangoes and engine oil for testing or whatever. Brilliant. Bravo that man. And what, these guys read it in a newspaper or something? There's nothing there, literally in the case of deaths. But hey, let's do it. So, just got started down before lockdown, continues down till effective, then goes the wrong way back up. Not really their fault, it was a tiny outbreak now over, and the growth decline has to recover to unity. That's worth highlighting. That's like the uptick at the beginning, which normal doesn't need. 0.001 cases going to 0.002 cases is perfectly acceptable. Real world has integer people, so when the cases stop 1, 2, 1, 1, 0, 1, the growth decline is basically unity, flat. Still nothing personal, but we had the sharp decline already started, continues normally, wrong way post, outbreak over, and relatively massive outbreak after. Lockdown fail. If someone wanted to come up with another definition of lockdown effectiveness, compliance of the populace, effectiveness of media disinformation, gullibility of the populace, silence of those paid by the government, capacity for fraudulent statements by government or corporate funded scientists and bodies, then sure, lockdown has been massively effective. But for modifying the trajectory of contagions, so far it's a massive no. Everything continues as normal, and when it does change, it gets worse. Go figure. UK too. Indeed, the UK, number 2 worst hit nation on the planet behind Belgium, number 3 if we include New York City, fraud central. Well, the UK and New York, USA have charts that are artwork for the criminally inclined, and we'll get to them, but we've been showing the absurdities of the UK chart since UK peak by proper growth decline equals unity measures, so from around mid-April. This exercise is merely to see how the rest of the world fared with lockdown. Not doing too well, is it? And the measures implemented in the name of lockdown, horrifying. If it wasn't already the most egregious abuse of democracy, the most absurdly destructive measure against the people who pay for the country, the private sector, while leaving the public sector conveniently ring-fenced, the totalitarian measures against the people, exemplified now by Leicester and Melbourne, are what would come to expect of puppet regimes in the Far East, Africa and South America. Instead, we're talking the UK and Australia. I don't know how bad it is in the US, I don't really follow the news or have time for all the excellent links I'm sent, but keep sending them. Someday we'll want an archive for all that's been done in the name of COVID. For now, let's finish off with a home country, EU core, France. I don't know the result, we'll find out together, but if lockdown worked, that'll be a first. So, France. 17th March to 11th May, another early one, a week before Boris. Textbook. One long decline at a constant rate. It had one data glitch, circle top and bottom, which kicked the growth up briefly, then it resumed at exactly the same gradient. Then it got fat, horizontal, failing to decline, excess cases, but no matter. Massive lockdown fail. So there you go, 20 countries so far, 4 no result where we couldn't fairly make a decision, typically because we lacked a before or an after. The complete absence of any useful or positive result from lockdown is marked. Other features we noticed, the precipitate manner, almost indecent haste of going into lockdown with minimal cases. Thank God they don't behave like this for flu. Or will they? Likewise, it didn't stop a lot of these countries having relatively massive outbreaks later. It could have been worse. Well, no, because lockdown has to be effective to do that, and if it has no effect, as we've seen, then no. Lockdown fail. Lockdown ought to have an effect, even I agree with that. But then the effect it's had on lives lost, non-COVID, destruction of the economy and liberty, destruction of jobs and careers, that's all very real. Disease is a part of life. Destruction of our way of life doesn't have to be. Lockdown was a choice massively promoted by Ferguson et al., and it has one purpose. Without lockdown, who needs a vaccine? But Gates et al., there'll be no normal until a vaccine. Thanks for making the agenda clear. We'll do the other videos too, I suspect, to complete the analysis, but I think the preliminary result is already pretty damning. We knew that lockdown had had no effect in the UK and that at peak the true fraud began. We recently checked New Zealand and Australia and no, lockdown fail. Now we have 22 countries, these 20s plus Oz and UK, lockdown fail. So much destruction for nothing. Literally nothing. I'm Andrew Mather, a 60-year-old Brit, mathematician, financier, technologist, husband, biker, pilot, healer, whatever. Feel free to get in touch, Andrew at peerlessreads.com or andrew@amather.com. Either should get